Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Kristian Stricklen, and I'm the Chief Communications and Engagement Officer for Indianapolis Public Schools, and I will be your moderator for today's important discussion as IPS presents Let's Chat, an honest conversation about race. Before we get started, I have one housekeeping note. If you have a question of our panelists, Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, type it in, and we'll review it and ask your questions of our panelists along the way. If everyone on the panel can make sure that they're muted, I think we'll get started. So, on May 25th, George Floyd died when Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin put his knee on the back of his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. During that time, 3 other officers stood by and did nothing, as George repeatedly said, "I can't breathe." This horrific death triggered protests and riots around the world. This certainly wasn't the first time that a Black person was killed mercilessly. You heard the names: Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Eric Garner, Michael Taylor, Dre'Jon Reed, and so many more right here in Indianapolis. But this latest incident was a tipping point, triggering unrest that's launched a movement like anything we've seen since the 1960s. Joining us for this conversation are 4 top leaders within IPS with their own unique perspective. First, Aleesia Johnson, our superintendent. She got her start in education as a teacher, working her way up to a school leader and then into the district administration before being named to the top spot almost 1 year ago to lead our district of more than 31,000 students. She is also the first African-American woman to do so. Michael O'Connor is the president of the IPS Board of School Commissioners and represents District 1. When he's not leading the board and fighting on behalf of the children and families of the district, he works as the Senior Director of Government Affairs at Eli Lilly and Company. Evan Hawkins serves as the Vice President of the board and represents District 3. He, along with President O'Connor and 5 other commissioners, work with the superintendent and the executive team to ensure that the district continues to move in the right direction. He works as the Executive Director of Facilities and Procurement at Marian University. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Pat Payne is the director of the IPS Racial Equity Initiative. She's worked at IPS for 58 years and led much of the effort to guide our teachers and administrators as the district and the school level in this important work. Welcome to our panelists. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here. You all bring a unique and passionate perspective to this discussion. So as we open this conversation, it's important to know where you are before you can know where you're going. So let's start with a level set or gut check. We've all done a lot of thinking and a lot of talking in the last few weeks, and that includes confronting our own biases, prejudice, and even racism. So Superintendent Johnson, we'll start with you. You had the monumental task of speaking to the entire district in the midst of this storm. In a letter you wrote to students, families, and staff, you bared your soul, emitting feelings of anger, despair, and fear. What have you realized about your own biases during all of this?
Yeah, first, thanks for everyone being here and joining in for the conversation and listening. I really appreciate the time that folks are taking to be with us today. The last several weeks certainly have been incredibly challenging for me, and personally, as a Black woman in this country, as a mother of Black children. I reference that oftentimes, and as a professional, as a leader of the organization. One thing I've been reflecting on recently, and it came from a conversation we've been having internally from one of my colleagues, We've, heard a lot about George Floyd. All the names that you've listed are Black men. And so I'm doing a lot of thinking around the place and how women show up as we continue to protest the injustices that happen, and specifically thinking about our LGBTQ community specifically. Tony McDade is a trans man who also was involved in a police shooting and died, but we've not heard that name in this space. And so that was a challenge from one of our colleagues here recently to think about how we make sure that as we are pursuing justice, making sure we are pursuing justice for everyone, and that's learning that I still need to continue to do in this work. So that's been something that I've really been thinking a lot about in the past few days.
Very good points. President O'Connor, you wrote an op-ed that ran in the Indianapolis Star last week where you acknowledged troubling thoughts and said you have years of unlearning to do and promised to demand more of yourself and call out racism when you see it. Can you share more about your thoughts that you shared in the paper?
Yeah, I think it's, I share Superintendent Johnson's sort of frustration with where we are, and having listened to colleagues and friends who are African American who then expressed frustration that that people who look like me, white people, would call and say, "What should I be doing?" And the reality is, we know what we should be doing. And I have had the privilege, maybe that many folks who look like me and have my background haven't had, but I've had the privilege of working in an organization that is a majority minority organization that is, by the way, as you can tell if you're watching this on Facebook Live, is led by Black women primarily, but certainly our largest population within an organization is African American students. And that, as I thought about sort of, gosh, I wish other people would change their perspective, I had to think about my own perspective, and I had to think about my own thoughts and my own failures. And that even as enlightened as I like to pretend I am a human being guilty of having learned a set of biases because of the system within which I was brought up here in Central Indiana. And if I've learned anything over the past couple of years, what I've learned from Pat Payne is that all those systems were built to favor people like me. And when you go through the racial equity training, the first thing you learn is everybody that is given training says, Mike O'Connor and others who look like me in this training, we're not blaming you individually, but we have to address this this stigma that is the system we were brought up in, that in fact, as I said, I at 56 years old have to unlearn decades of what was, for lack of a better word, whitewashed history about how this country was founded, the systems that were built, whether it is our home mortgage system that was built to make sure that primarily white middle class people could get home mortgages, but that we could lock minorities, African Americans, and quite frankly, people in poverty into a situation, a cycle of poverty that's very difficult to get out of. And that as I thought more and more about it, and as I think about this what I hear from colleagues about protests and other things in this conversation about if people could just protest peacefully, they would get listened to more. And I thought about the Colin Kaepernick situation. And quite frankly, if I was going to be courageous, I would have identified this 2 years ago, not 2 weeks ago. But that there is an example of the system, right? The white-run system saying, not only are we going to not listen to your appropriate way to protest, but we're going to take your livelihood away. Then, in fact, we have so much unlearning to do, but we also have a responsibility that I'm Catholic, I'm taught to ask for forgiveness is to extend grace. I am extending grace to the people I'm asking forgiveness from by asking them to give me that forgiveness. And they extend that grace back to me by providing that forgiveness, by saying, I'm not perfect, I'm going to try to do better. I think as we look at the history of all of these things that result in Black people being treated differently than white people, Black people not having the same starting advantage that white people have, we first have to apologize for not fixing the system sooner, not acting sooner, and not standing in solidarity with our brothers and sisters, and however anyone identifies. I think Superintendent Johnson's point was very important. That not only am I going to apologize for not acting sooner, but when I see it, I will call it out. I grew up in a family where, quite frankly, my parents were very progressive, but at their generation, it was impolite to talk about religion and race. And we have to say, no, we have to have real adult conversations about race.
We appreciate your transparency. That's exactly what we're here to do today. And so, Dr. Payne, this is a conversation you've been leading and participating in for many years. Yet I imagine, like all of us, you still must regularly do a gut check. Can you share your thoughts about that?
Yes. First of all, I just want to say how blessed I feel to still be in the Indianapolis Public Schools and see that we have finally reached this point where we have leaders like Commissioner O'Connor, like Commissioner Hawkins, and our superintendent, who are able to understand the barriers that we have been through and how we must break them. Yes, I have been in this work for a very, very, very long time, but this is a journey. This is a journey that everyone is on. And so I do still have to do my spot checking also, because there's something called cognitive dissonance. And so your belief system is always fighting against the truths that try to enter it. So you are always having to have this battle with yourself. And that does not mean that Black people and people who look like me aren't doing the same thing that our white brethren are doing. You have, because this is a journey and because you are constantly learning from others and the experiences that you have, you do have to continuously put a check on your own self.
Thank you. Commissioner Hawkins, you also wrote an op-ed that actually was posted on the Indianapolis Recorder website yesterday, as well as you had a conversation with our partners at Radio 1 yesterday. And so from a governance standpoint, you said school board members and educational leaders run the risk of falling short in the important work we're doing if you don't examine your own biases first. So what personal biases have you discovered?
Thank you for the question, Kristian. I mean, I can't help but think about my grandmother in this particular time. And, you know, I would say that she turned 40 years old, roughly, she was about 40 years old around 1965 when she got the right to vote. And which is ironically my age-ish at this time. She was born in Jim Crow, Kentucky, and when she moved into her home in the 1960s into a predominantly white neighborhood, she moved into that neighborhood at night, in the middle of the night with her family. With my mother, who was 10 years old at the time, similar age to my daughter, my oldest daughter today. And so what I definitely realized is that I think it's been easy for me to dismiss sort of her experiences from the past. And so for me, I think in relationship to the question I think it's easy for me, especially as a Black man, to somehow disconnect history from the current, as if those images that we see on TV of vicious dogs or cannons and things of that nature are from an era of the past, when in reality, they weren't very long ago. The 1950s, 60s, and the eras before that weren't long ago. And so I have the benefit and certainly the privilege to be able to see and touch the history from my grandmother. And so, and that is such a blessing to ensure that we continue to connect the relationship between our history and our current reality.
Thank you. Dr. Payne, I'm going to go back to you for a minute. This conversation isn't the first effort to talk about race, with the district and its impact in our schools and our students. Conversations like these started decades ago, and more recently in 2015, IPS partnered with the Racial Equity Institute in Greensboro, North Carolina to elevate our understanding. That included 2-day racial equity training sessions for all teachers and staff. To date, 100% of staff from more than 29 of our schools have participated in that initiative, in addition to hundreds of employees from across the district. And then last summer, Superintendent Johnson named racial equity as one of the district's top priorities. That spurred many other plans and actions. So Dr. Payne, can you give a brief overview of some of the other things IPS is actively doing to address race now and in the coming school year? You have to unmute.
Can you hear me now? I want to start with the vision that our district equity team has, and it says, an IPS community where student outcomes cannot be predicted by race or ethnicity. That is so important to us because it's really crazy when you know who's going to be at the bottom even before the test is given. That's what we are working against. And this school district has done many things. First of all, now all new teachers have to come through racial equity training. That's a first. Principals are being exposed to resource materials that will help them be able to lead conversations on race and racism. This is not an easy thing to do. And so we want them to feel comfortable doing this. In fact, we are using a book. Can you see this? It's by Paul Gorski, and it's full of case studies, very similar to what happens in the schools. And what they are able to do is use these case studies and work as in groups to come up, and it has a framework, an equity framework that we apply to each one of the cases. So we're doing that at every principals meeting. Also, town halls. We've been having, the board has had town halls, and there will be other town halls where race is the central subject. We are in the process of developing a board policy on racial equity that the board will soon receive. And so we could go on and on and on. All schools, right now we have 29 equity schools where all of the staff have gone through the training, but our goal is for every school in IPS to be an equity school, and that's going to happen also.
Thank you. We actually have a couple of questions that I want to take around this topic. And one of them, I think you really just answered, but it says, why are some schools not on the list of Racial Equity Institute schools? Some white parents are under the impression that their schools are participating when they are not on the list. So they want to know if the list is up to date, and what is the criteria for a school being considered a pilot racial equity school, and why quite a number of IPS schools are not on the list?
Well, that's not going to take much longer because it is our goal for every school to be an equity school. So, and in fact, we are in the process now of working with the Racial Equity Institute to offer virtual equity training. So we'll be able probably to start that in early July. And that'll be the beginning of the process to get all schools, because this, and the superintendent, I'm sure, will speak on this. It is our goal for all schools to be equity schools, because all schools have our students, so that just makes sense. But we did feel it was important to start with a smaller number of schools so we could see what we felt works. The district equity team, and we're working on redeveloping our district equity team also, because the goal is for us to partner with the school equity teams. The goal of the school equity team, because you got to have more to do than just those 2 days of training. What then? And so we have to make sure that the work is still being carried on in the schools following the training. Everybody gets a comprehensive workbook, and now everybody is getting what is called 21 days of reinforcement that's just full of resources so the school can continue to work. We want equity schools to make sure they are disaggregating their data, because only when you disaggregate can you see who's always at the bottom, and to question why the same groups are always at the bottom. And so it's a process that we're working on, but the important thing is that all of our schools will be equity schools.
Thank you. Another question is, Dr. Payne mentioned all new teachers are required to receive racial equity training. Does that include teachers at our innovation schools?
I'll let the superintendent answer that.
They're in our innovation schools are invited to be a part of it. They aren't our employees, so it's not a condition of their employment, but certainly a number of our schools that are innovation schools participate in racial equity and have equity teams. I can think of a few off the top of my head who are participating.
And then also, is there a plan, I believe we said this, but just as if Dr. Payne or Superintendent Johnson, if you'll reiterate it, but is there a plan to ensure that other new and old staff that are not teachers, such as psychologists and SLPs, to engage in equity training?
Yeah, there is. Dr. Payne and I have talked about this. I think the board and I have talked about this. And I think actually the gift, if you can call it that, from the pandemic will be the fact that that training can happen virtually, which means our capacity to train more people will grow significantly and substantially. Everybody is responsible for the children in our school, and everybody lives and breathes the same air of racism that exists in our country. And so the goal would be that we started with schools, and we've had central service folks go in and get trained, but the goal is to, yes, across our district, ensure that everyone has participated.
We've had some of our IPS officers who have been through the training. So absolutely, everybody who touches the life of a child. We want our school bus drivers, anybody that our food service people, they touch the life of a child. So that is our goal, and we plan to reach it.
Amen.
Thank you. Let's move on and talk a little bit about the Black male perspective. Commissioner Hawkins, if you can explain the impact of these injustices and the importance of getting it right this time, like a Black man who's seen as a dangerous threat. Can you give us an up close and personal look at what it's like to be a Black man in America today and the disadvantages you've encountered as a result?
Yeah, thank you, Kristian. I mean, I'll just be fully transparent. This is a difficult conversation to have because it conjures up emotion, and I can definitely acknowledge that. You know, I think as Black people, we have been conditioned and have conditioned ourselves to compartmentalize our pain at times, and so therefore that conversation or this conversation can be difficult. So I appreciate the question and the dialogue here. You know, when I think about my youth, you know, I can remember being maybe 10 or 12 years old and walking to my grandparents' house after school in a predominantly white neighborhood, and remember being followed by the police. And I didn't really think much of it at the time, but looking back on it, what if I had run? I'm just imagining what would that have looked like, me running in a predominantly white neighborhood. I think fast forward, I can certainly reflect on an experience where being pulled over because I allegedly fit a description, but then being released with nothing beyond that whatsoever, but being held up for an hour and a half. I think even more recently, when running for school board, I can remember being referred to as a wolf in sheep's clothing, and which really means that I'm a dangerous threat and not who I say I am. And so, what does it mean for me and to be Black and to be a Black man in America means that, for me, it means the fear of driving with the taillight out, the fear of or the concern about walking in my neighborhood at night, carrying the weight of being the only person that looks like me and oftentimes in business settings, dealing with the microaggressions and the insensitive humor. We're just joking. Don't take it personal. And I think having to explain all of this all the time to so many people who feel entitled to my energy and my time. And it's just outright exhausting. And so this is important that we get it right, because this is crushing.
I appreciate your honesty. I know it is a very difficult topic, and I would welcome our other panelists, to jump in. I know as a mother of a Black son myself, and who also has special needs, I know I fear for him. And I actually shared those thoughts on Facebook because it is something that we should not have to think about, and yet we do. But I definitely open up the floor.
Kristian, if I might, the one of the things for those who didn't see my op-ed, one of my own personal confessions, and I live in a relatively diverse neighborhood where it isn't unusual to see people of all colors walking around, but that as I said, there's years of unlearning that I had to recognize in myself that I differentiated. If I saw a group of teenagers walking by, we live near a park. If I see a group of teenagers walking by, that quite frankly, I had a different reaction to a group of Black teenagers versus white teenagers. And that's a me problem, right? What Commissioner Hawkins, who I have learned so much from, what he expressed so emotionally, that isn't a him problem. That isn't a Black problem. That is a white problem. That is what I am talking about with regards to years of unlearning, right? We've been told to think that way. And we have to say, not only am I not going to think that way, but I, Mike O'Connor, am going to make sure that when I hear somebody react that way, when I see somebody react that way, when I see it happen, I will make a stand because no one should have a fear about, if I get pulled over, I know I probably ran a stoplight, something, but I don't fear what the result of that traffic or that interaction with the police officer. I don't have to think about what that interaction is going to result in. And quite frankly, it was Dr. Farabee and I having a discussion because we have kids in sort of the same age group, and his son was getting ready to start to learn how to drive, and we talked about the conversation he had to have with his son that I never had to have with my children, and that I have to understand that is fundamentally wrong, and we won't fix that today. We won't fix that next year, but to Dr. Payne's perspective, when you walk out after 2 very emotional days of training in the Racial Equity Institute at IPS, your job isn't done. Your job is just starting.
That's right.
And while I learned those things, now I have to apply them. And so as a school board member, I also have to apply them in the way in which I get incoming questions and suggestions and advice from parents and families at IPS, but I also have to work with my colleagues on the board to make sure our policies are addressing fundamentally that mindset of making sure that we're correcting those actions of the past.
This conversation is so powerful. I want to just give you an example of how this racist system, how strong it is. If you all will recall, I think this happened maybe about 3 weeks ago in Central Park, as I recall. And there was a young man, in fact, doing bird watching in the park. And he saw this young lady, white lady, walking her dog without a leash, and called her to it and asked her if she would put the leash on the dog. Well, she was so incensed that she almost, in fact, choked her dog to death because she was so incensed, trying to call the police on this Black man. And when she did, she didn't say, there's a man that's disturbed. She said, there is an African American man, because she knew when she called it out as African American, the usual response is, we'll be right there. Of course, it didn't happen that way, but this is an example of how strong racism, the systemic racism, runs.
Absolutely. And she did say that. I recall that she purposely said that that was what she was going to say when
Yes.
she called the police, because she knew that
Exactly.
that would be the response. So thankfully, it did not turn into anything worse than it already was. But I want to kind of jump into our next section. But before I do, just a reminder, if you have questions, and I know that some of you have shared questions, so thank you, and we'll continue to take them as we go along. Just definitely go ahead and post those, hit the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and submit your questions, and we'll ask them as we go along, and then of course at the end. But staying on track with what Dr. Payne was just sharing with what happened in Central Park, the next question is around white privilege. And Commissioner O'Connor, you touched on acknowledging your white privilege in your op-ed, and said you were profoundly sad because we can't begin to solve a problem until we identify it. And you quoted an old phrase that says, I have met the problem and it is us. So how do you describe white privilege, and how it's helped you and how you can use it to help Black people?
Well, I think something, that we've heard Superintendent Johnson talk about in the past, something that we heard Dr. Payne talk about moments ago, this is where it starts, right? What we know is we can, with great reliability, look at our student population and look at the color of their skin and guess where they are going to perform at from our academic standard levels, purely on the basis of their skin. And we know that is a long historical standing issue, and we know that is a uniform issue across the country. And that white privilege is saying, well, that's just the way it is, as opposed to saying our system is broken. It's, we've all seen the sign that says the system isn't broken, it's operating like it's supposed to be. And that if it is uniform for years, and if it is uniform across the country, then we can challenge the aspect whether the system is broken or the system is operating the way it is supposed to. If it isn't broken and is operating the way it is supposed to, it is the definition of white privilege. And it is our job to challenge that. Part of also white privilege is to not be challenged on the accomplishments we may have had, and not have to ask ourselves, it's the old question, did I hit a home run, or was I born on third? And that for a significant number of us, we got an advanced base somewhere along the way, simply because of our color, our station in life, our parental situation, our whatever that may be. And again, I think Dr. Payne's work in racial equity, when those of us who look like me sit down, very careful to say, Mike, we're not picking on you, but we're scratching at the surface of the history you have learned. And so be open-minded to understand that while you've worked hard, You had a hand up. You had a step up on this. And so how do I can point to a million things, whether it's the opportunity to have a job in government at a very young age, that my brothers and sisters who are of a different color didn't have the same access to that because my parents were politically engaged. It's sort of, I was at the right place at the right time, but I had that put up because of my color. No doubt about it. No doubt about it. And so as we think about sort of that white privilege, how do we articulate it in a way and open the minds and open the hearts of people to sort of say, I'm not saying Mike O'Connor myself isn't worthy of the things I have accomplished, but perhaps I had a step up. And then how do I, as I think about my job today is education policy, how do I work with the leadership at IPS to make sure that we are implementing education policy that not only eliminates that privilege, that step up, but levels the playing field for all of our students, particularly our students of color. Because what we know in Indianapolis and Marion County is, if you are born in poverty, our community is one of the hardest places to move out of poverty. So how do we fix that? And the reason I am on this board is because I believe education is the way in which we fix that. And education with a racial equity mindset is the way in which we begin to undo the years and years of history of setting it up so that we know white children will be more successful than black children because we have a system that was designed to produce that.
I want to open that question up to the floor if there's anyone else on the panel.
Yeah, Kristian, I think I want to just kind of jump in here as well. And I appreciate Commissioner O'Connor's response there. I think he hit on the word history. And I know Dr. Payne has lifted up our history, the truth, many and many a times throughout her journey. And as we think about, I'm just looking at the faces on this Zoom call right now. I know we're all zoomed out, but we're here on Zoom. But 100 years ago, we think about the composition of our state government, our local government, and even this school district was operated by the Ku Klux Klan. And I think that is critical that we acknowledge that. And in so many cases, practices, procedures, protocols were implemented from that mindset. And there's no way to disconnect that truth from where we are today in our community. And so I want to encourage particularly our white brothers and sisters that are looking for a moment of what do I do next? And it starts with history. It starts with asking questions like why? Why is it that I'm the only one, or why are there not any other people in my community, my neighborhood that look different? Why is that? And it isn't frankly rooted in a dynamic of people having free will to move around where they want to. I think some of us certainly do have that opportunity, but in reality, there were institutions and structures that told people, Black people, people of color, where they could live, how they could live, and things of that nature. So this system, as Commissioner O'Connor said, was set up this way. And so I encourage particularly those of white brothers and sisters that are doing the work to keep doing the work and pressing into our history and ask and continue to ask questions about why things are how they are.
Yes. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Commissioner.
Well, I was only gonna. I think everything Commissioner Hawkins just said is absolutely correct, except I would only correct one thing, which is it wasn't even as far back as 100 years ago that the KKK controlled our government. It was as far back as 70, 75 years ago. And so it's not that far back in our history. It's more recent, and that should disturb us all.
Wow. Right now, the superintendent's leadership team, we are reading a book entitled Polite Protest by Richard Pierce, and I would certainly recommend that to everyone watching this because it tells you the complete truth about the history of racism in Indianapolis. And it's still going on. It's still going on, but it gives you that trail to let you know why we are still where we have always been. Things have improved now, but it's still there. And so when we talk about this white privilege, in fact, in our training, we were told to call it white advantage instead of white privilege, because that will then give, because you hear people say, well, I grew up poor. When my family came to this country, we had to scrape for everything, but their skin was still white. So they had the privileges that we with black and brown skin do not have to this day, as you can see. So it's very important. What is her name? Peggy McIntosh. Yes, Peggy McIntosh. I think it's called Unpacking the White Knapsack. I would also recommend that you read that, because she gives all these examples of things in life that she doesn't have to worry about when she goes in the drugstore, or she goes in the store. She's not followed, you see. And she said she grew up believing that it was her job to teach people of color to be more like, it's like teaching them to be more like us. That was her job. So, and you know, we have teachers who also think that. So we are, as I said, we are all on this journey learning, and that's why it is just so amazing that this district is doing what we are now doing.
O'Connor, we have a question for you. Can you describe white privilege in terms of ideology? What are some assumptions of white privilege in terms of our everyday thinking? What are some assumptions that white teachers may have that show their white privilege?
I think the first, I'd go back to where I left off with this issue of we know when we look at a classroom just based on the system who's going to be where, and so in our expectations, right? What's the damning aspect of lower expectations. And so the first thing we can do is have the same set of expectations for all of our, making sure that we provide educational opportunities at the level of need to each of the students that allows them to succeed. And to Dr. Payne's conversation, not try to teach them to be more like the white people, but to learn and think and feel as they do, but to understand we have to have the same expectations of academic performance, but that means we have to provide the level of educational services to allow them to perform at that academic level. That in fact, equity isn't equality. Equity is delivering the level. Yeah, I learned from you, Dr. Payne. That is providing for that student's level of need, so that we can assume and make sure we have the same set of demands academically for that student that we have for all of our students, but understanding that may require differential provisions of services. And by services, I mean differential levels of spending money on our student population to meet their needs, not an equal distribution of funds by the head count. I would also say something. I'm going back to an earlier question, Kristian, but the sort of where white privilege plays out, if I choose, as I could have done last week and the week before, to participate in the protests, and I would only participate in those peaceful protests, but if I participate in a protest as a white person, I'm seen as having higher values and sort of being progressive. Whereas if our African-American friends, brothers, sisters, and however they identify participate, as soon as they participate in a protest, they're seen as thugs. And that is the ultimate white privilege. If I'm enlightened, I'm enlightened. If you're enlightened, you stand the risk of being identified as a thug.
I mean, I would break it down as far as, if you looked on Twitter today, Band-Aid announced that they are changing their flesh-toned bandages to represent all shades of people. You know, again, it is 2020. How long has that company been around? And it's like, okay, we heard you and we get it. And so when you go to the store, I think this is in Peggy McIntosh's piece, and you buy a Band-Aid and it looks the color of your skin, because that communicates a message that that is the normal or standard sort of presentation of people. When I want to buy a pair of nude colored shoes, I literally am hard pressed to find that in any shoe store in America. I literally have searched online for black skin nude heels as a Black woman who's looking for a pair of shoes that align to my skin tone. I have to do work to find that. And so I think that is what the advantage for white people is. You don't have to do the same level of work. It doesn't mean you're not looking. It doesn't mean everything comes to you and is handed to you on a silver platter. No one's saying that. But the work and the load that is carried by Black people is heavier, period. Full stop. There's no debating. That is the truth of our country.
Yes. And this carries on into the classroom. Just like Commissioner O'Connor said, when you are making negative assumptions and negative stereotypes about the children that you teach, that's how they will be treated in the classroom. And sometimes it's done and you don't even realize you're doing it because you've been doing it for so long. And may I also say, this doesn't just apply to white teachers. We have teachers of color also who have internalized this racism because it's always coming at us through the media, through actions. And see, so that's why we always have to be checking ourselves also in terms of the way we treat our students of color. These conversations, I might say, are not easy. And next week, in fact, we'll be having these kinds of conversations with our principals because they have asked for this. They want to be able, as educational leaders, to be able to have these kind of conversations going on in their schools. It's just so very important, and they are welcoming these conversations.
I want to point out something, and I want to give particular credit to Commissioner Gore, Commissioner Elizabeth Gore, who's an at-large commissioner, who's really demanded of me and of our board to rethink what I think are a set of expectations built in this white privilege, and that is when we look at the disciplinary actions at our school levels, and we just assume that the Black male students are going to have higher disciplinary, higher suspensions, higher actions taken against them, and it doesn't. We don't ask enough about the fundamental questions of why that is. We just assume that is, and instead of asking our schools, are we doing enough to challenge that assumption, or are we, as Dr. Payne just said, working regardless of the teacher, where the teacher comes from, what the teacher's color may be, are we just working with that assumption as we walk into class that we're going to have a higher level of student suspension among our African American male students? And we need to challenge that question fundamentally more. And as I said, Commissioner Gore has really leaned on me heavy to think about that differently.
Yes, because students will bend to meet your low expectations, just like they will rise to meet your high expectations.
I'd like to mention, as part of our racial equity work, we do have an affinity group that has been recently formed called Confronting White Privilege Affinity Group. And I know that there have been some conversations and definitely, more to come on that. Dr. Payne, if you want to speak about some of that, you already did as far as the conversation with principals next week, but if you want to share a little bit more about that.
Yeah, this is just starting with the guidance of Andrew Strope. They're starting a white affinity group. but we're also discussing having Black affinity groups and other groups, because this gives people an opportunity to come together and discuss and look at what is going on in our district, in our country, in fact, that impacts the lives of our students, and what we can do to enlighten people to do a better job. This is just so, and I don't think I've ever heard of a school district that is going to the lengths that our school district is going through to make sure that we are touching the lives in a very positive way of all of our students. So we are looking forward to seeing what comes from this white affinity group.
So we do have a question. I am one of 6 new PTA board members of one of our IPS schools. We are all women and we are all white, but our school student body is nearly half and half Black and white families. What are some concrete steps as an executive board can we take in the coming months to better serve our school community and make everyone feel represented, included, and heard?
I think, for one thing, that first of all, let me say that it is so important that our parents are involved in this process. So I applaud you for being involved in this process. But you need to see the same kinds of things that we've been talking about. Look at that disaggregated data for the students in your school, and you will see who's at the bottom, who's at the top. And you got to start questioning this. Look at the special education classes in your school, and you will see who it's filled with, usually African-American males. You got to question this. Why is this happening? These children come out of the womb as geniuses. So what happens the longer they are in school, the longer they're out in society? What happens to dumb them down? Something is very wrong. Look at the what do you call it? The high achievement classes, gifted and talented classes in your school. Who is this filled with? I'll tell you who is not filled with, and that's children of color. See, you got to start questioning what is going on. Look around your school. Look at the bulletin boards in the classrooms. Look at the pictures on the wall. Are they reflective of the children who are in their school and the society that they are growing up in? So there are a lot of things that parents can do.
And then to that specific comment, I would say diversify your leadership board. Either that's growing it to add more people or shifting some roles, but I think the composition of that team has to look different.
Yes.
Yeah, and I would add on to that, sort of from my experience. I spent years in the city administration with Mayor Peterson, and we would occasionally sit down to deal with the community issue. And if anybody's ever been in the large conference room on the 25th floor of the mayor's office, and if we were dealing with the community issue, and Mayor Peterson would look around and he would stop the meeting and say, "We can't have this meeting. The people participating in this meeting don't look like our community." And so when we're ready with the people around the table that look like our community, we can then have this meeting. And that then it's fundamentally questioned, sort of, what if your call to serve was sent the sort of normal way, and you got, God bless you for participating, by the way, I don't mean this as a criticism, but you got 6 white parents of the school that is 50-50, then you need to change the way in which you issue your call to participate. You need to that's another way of privilege. Pardon my home phone ringing behind me. That's another sort of perspective of privilege. Was it sent via email only? Are there ways in which you can reach into that other 50% of the community and urge those parents, male, female, whatever, to participate on your PTA? So that should be part of your responsibility, is to make sure as Superintendent Johnson said, that your PTA looks like your school looks.
And I think if I can piggyback as well is, you know, this question isn't simply just a school-based question. You know, I think as communities, whatever shade of skin that we have or are, I would challenge, you know, the question, as well as others that might be pondering this question, to think about your network. As you think about the neighborhood that you live in, think about the church where you worship. You think about the organizations, the partnerships, the clubs, you know, the affiliations. What do those look like, and what do they say? And so I think this isn't just a question of from a school-based level. This is really examining and prosecuting our entire network from Monday through Sunday.
So as you would imagine, considering all of the things that have been happening, we do have a question around policing. Is there going to be any changes to SROs in our schools? I've seen school districts in Minneapolis, Denver, Portland, and many others ending the contract they have with armed police in schools. There's also a lot of studies showing that SROs have a negative impact on Black and Latinx students' sense of safety. Will anything change for them? So I know we have our own police office, but Aleesia, do you want to take it?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I'm watching the news, obviously, like everybody else, very closely as districts and cities are making different decisions about what policing looks like in their communities. And so, you know, have gotten with our general counsel, whoever, and our chief to, one, look at our data regularly. We have been making concerted efforts since 2015 under Dr. Farabee's administration to actually reduce the number of officers that we have employed in the district. So that reduction has happened over the past 5 years. But there's certainly a question of the nature of that relationship and what it needs to look like moving forward. And so that's something we're currently examining.
Thank you. So I know that we're at an hour and we have had lots of questions and great questions. And I do want to say that this is obviously the first of several conversations. One of the things that we did realize when we decided to have this particular panel is that this topic is just so vast. There's no way that you can get everything done at one time. So there will be several other conversations coming, and look out for more information about that in the coming weeks. And we'll have additional panelists to join us at that time. But as we are at an hour, I do want to ask, what's next and where do we go from here? I know that that's something the superintendent and I've talked about. Conversating is one thing, but action is necessary. So I know that this has been a difficult conversation with no easy answers. And I do thank you all for your honesty. So as we wrap up this discussion, I'd really like to give each of you a minute to sum up in your words, where do we go from here?
I'm happy to start. I think, you know, for me, what I feel very proud of is that these are not new conversations that we've been having in our school district. As Dr. Payne's talked about, they've taken different iterations over time, but we have been deeply engaging in these conversations for you know, an extended amount of time, and very focused on making racial equity a priority in our district and making sure we are cultivating the mindset so that no one has to question the position of our leadership team, myself, our board, on where we stand on this issue. The next step to that, as we have taken actions to educate and make folks aware, you know, there are policies and practices that we have to deeply examine and make sure that there's a right and there's a wrong. You know, there's research or there's documentation or there's experience that shows us this is positive and this is not. And so how do we, again, continue to make those shifts in the right direction for our district? It is a journey. And I think what I appreciate so much about Dr. Payne is honoring the journey that we are all on and taking as we are growing and learning together. We are not perfect. I am not perfect. We will mess up. So let me just say that we will mess up. But what we commit to is when we have those mess ups is doing our best to come back and correct and to learn and to grow. And so I want to make sure we all feel like we have the permission to do that. But that ultimately our job is to make sure every child who is a part of Indianapolis public schools, Black, brown, white, feels loved, valued in the same way they came out of the womb, ready to prosper and cultivate and flourish. Our job is not to tamp that. Our job is to cultivate that for every child. And so that's what we commit ourselves to.
Dr. Payne?
You all have just blown my mind today. It's just so wonderful to see that our district has reached this point. I guess I want to end by saying that to let our educators and all employees know that you don't have an option here. You don't have an option of getting out of this just because your belief system tells you you don't want to do it. This is part of your job. And so we want to welcome everybody to this. And you can't have one kind of mindset from 8 to 3 and then go home and do something else very different. No. This has to be a lifestyle. That's what it is. And that's what we want to help you and everybody. Like I said, I keep saying that word. The superintendent said it. And you got to remember, this is a journey and we're all still learning on it. And we're just going to keep building on what we're already doing in this district. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, Kristian, I'll go ahead and jump in as well. I mean, I just want to just acknowledge that I think for all of us participating in this Zoom call and those tuning in as well as just around this country and world, I mean, it's so important that we acknowledge the grief and the pain that we are all feeling in some form or fashion. I mean, this is pandemic, economic security, and the endemic of racism, right? And so this is pressure that many of us, I know I haven't ever felt before in this experience. And I think that I don't want to disconnect that reality from our young people, from our children who are trying to, amongst their community, amongst their family and networks, trying to navigate and understand this because they're feeling this too, absorbing this pain and grief as well. I think I want to certainly echo the superintendent's reflection there that to every Black child, Black boy, Black girl, children of color, and frankly, all children, you are loved. And we see your grief, we feel your grief and pain, particularly in these circumstances. And so I want each one of you to know that. I think as a board member and as in that responsibility as a board member, I am so encouraged by this district and this administration and the board's focus on implementing practices and procedures that call out disrupt racial inequities. And this is the journey that we're on, as many of us have said, but it's critical that we be focused, very intentional, and held accountable.
Thank you. Commissioner O'Connor.
Kristian, I'm gonna go back I'm gonna go back to a question you asked me about what I said in my op-ed, and it's something I believe very, very we have to deal with, which is racism is a white person's problem. Now we create hardships on you, anybody who doesn't look like us, but if we're going to solve this, those of us who occupy, quite frankly, the political middle and think of ourselves as open-minded, we have to own the fact that racism is a white person's problem, and that the solutions reside in our willingness to recognize that and remedy it. That we can't put, which is what we've done historically, we cannot put the pressure on the African-American community to solve racism. We have to work with you to help us identify where maybe we're blind, right? We all know unconscious bias exists, and we all have our own unconscious bias. But when I said I have met the enemy and the enemy is us, I mean me. It is our problem. We will not find a solution that gets us out of the cycle that we continually get into. And so that's what I think is the challenge in front of us, is working with folks, doing what I think Dr. Payne and her team have done so well, which is saying it's a learning process, but we need you to unlearn a few things before you can learn the new things. And that as a community, a leadership group, or whatever, that those of us who occupy seats that have the opportunity to influence policy, we have to recognize this is a white person's problem.
Thank you for that. I do want to acknowledge that there were several questions around, how do we have this conversation with our teachers? How do we have these conversations with our students, as well as how parents can support this work? And as I mentioned, there are going to be other conversations after this one, and we will address those particular topics. As I said, we knew that to have a very honest and open conversation, we were going to have to do more than one. And so definitely, be on the lookout for more information about in the coming weeks when we will have those conversations. But I do want to just thank all of our panelists and to everyone who has tuned in for this powerful conversation. Thank you, each of you, for your honesty and your transparency. This has been amazing. So as I said, this is the first one, and we really wanted to kick this off with a soul-bearing discussion, because you have to start with yourself before you can move forward. And so we will be having more coming in the next few weeks.
Kristian, if I can just let folks know to hit the website. If they go to myips.org, we do have resources as folks are, again, on their journey to learn. We have the article, the Peggy McIntosh article is actually linked on the website, along with some other books, recommendations, and then there's a list of resources for families talking to their children with some different age-appropriate resources there. So definitely want to direct folks there. Those things exist right now.
Thank you. I was just about to say that.
One more thing. Resource. In terms of resources, we also have a guide on the website for white teachers and parents who are developing consciousness and moving into action. And the very last thing I want to say is that this is not a moment in the history of IPS. This is a movement.
That's right. So in addition to all of those resources, we also have a toolkit. It's called the Say Their Names Toolkit, in honor of those individuals who have lost their lives because of these injustices. And we will have resources on our website after every conversation. So as Dr. Payne and Superintendent Johnson said, definitely go to www.myips.org. We already have those up right now. For those of you who have joined us today, if you know someone who was unable to join us, this has been recorded. We will have it up on our website. It will also be up on our YouTube channel. And so I highly encourage you to share this with all of your family and friends, and to come back and look at it again, because it's a lot of information in a short period of time. And so I know I'll be going back and listening again myself, just because we want to continue to grow. And so we just look forward to continuing this journey with each of you as we really are working to, push forward real change. That is the goal here. And with that, I say thank you and good afternoon. Have a good day. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.